I first became interested in silent animation, I would say, as an infant. So at some point, I'd say around age 7 or 8, my father came across a bunch of old 16mm films, and the experience of seeing the film projector running and of seeing cartoons that I was not able to see on tape or on television was really a mesmerizing experience for me. And from that point forward, I was hooked.
These were guys figuring out how to do this for the first time.
They were merely experimenting as much as they could.
And that sort of proved what people had noticed over the years, over the centuries. When two things come very quickly, there's a kind of blur overlap of the pictures, and they call that the persistence of vision.
Something that should not happen, happens. Something that is inert and lifeless takes on the spirit of life.
The general public thinks, oh, well, Walt Disney and Looney Tunes, it really started earlier than that.
Most people don't know that there was animation before Steamboat Willie.
These were films that were being created at the most primordial stages of the art form.
And there's just a charm seeing them learn as they go along.
The patience and the ability to do identical images with a slight difference on an industrial scale.
There are just so many visual styles that were used in the films.
It is kind of a lost art form.
People that are into animation, everybody loves something different. There's people that just like the Disney stuff. There's people that just like Looney Tunes. Regardless, everybody needs to go back and look at silent animation at least a little bit. To have some sort of a basis in where all this came from, you need to watch these cartoons. If you have any interest in animation at all, that's where animation began.
Well, I mean, historically, you really have to go way back before film. You'd have to go back to, like, optical toys. You'd have to go back to slideshows. I mean, all of those mediums were creating animation for an audience long before the birth of film.
The first germ of the idea of moving pictures is found in a child's toy, the trauma trope. If you twirl the disc rapidly, the images seem to form a new and completely different picture. It is, of course, an optical illusion. The retina of the eye retains an impression of a luminous object a full third of a second after the actual light source has disappeared. Soon, many gadgets based on the same principle were sold at county fairs and marketplaces. Grown-ups and children alike were enthralled.
The zoetrope was a canister with changeable strips of pictures in it. And that really became the shutter, the motion picture camera years later. The idea that something interrupted your view of the film, otherwise everything would look like a blur. It's magic. That's how the early animation was presented. Most people didn't know how it was done. They could have figured it out. People with the camera figured it out very early because the hand crank camera, if you stopped it and then started again and didn't move it, the scene in front of you changed. And that was, everybody must have known that was the thing not to do. But the ones that figured out, well, if I could use that creatively, then something might happen, something nice might happen.
There were quite a lot of early films that had little bits of rudimentary animation, where an item made of clay will momentarily squeeze and move aside. And there's quite a lot of stop-motion animation with furniture or toys or other items sort of wiggling, jiggling, or occasionally seeming to take on a life of their own.
Animation in general was an international art form. We don't really know who the very first film animator was. Anybody who knew how a camera operated would sooner or later discover that possibility, and maybe there were many animators that we don't know about who did.
But if we're going to speak about animated cartoons as an animated drawing, then some of the first uses of animated drawings came in the work of J. Stuart Blackton and of Émile Cohl in France.
Well, Blackton was born in England, and he came to the United States at an early age, a cartoonist reporter for newspapers. He was fascinated with trick films. He had seen Méliès's work. Méliès was a magician, and so this shows in his work, the trick film where you would stop the action, make a change, and then continue the action so that things appeared magically. His claim to animation history is that we believe he was one of the first, if not the first, to make sequential drawings, frame by frame.
There's not a lot of fluid animation. Things don't sort of move gracefully from one pose to another. It's just a sudden sharp jerk from one pose to the next. So it's difficult to say that it's real animation, but it's right on the edge. It's fooling the eye in a crude way.
Émile Cohl was a caricaturist and a cartoonist for periodicals in France, and he became interested in animation early on, and starting in 1908, he made over 200 short films, very surreal films with a lot of metamorphosis and interesting graphics.
Maybe one could make the best argument for Cohl, where his early film Phantasmagorie in 1908 featured a stick figure of a clown cavorting and rushing through a whole bunch of strange and crazy metamorphosis sequences. It could be nothing other than a drawing.
And that tells a little bit of a story. So they feel that brought it all together.
There's something magical that happens when a line, an inert line, comes to life. And if that inert line looks like a stick figure, that's even more of an enhancement. And if that stick figure has a personality, an individuality, it's another world.
Nonsense, that's the one.
Tommy's Cartoon Carnival is what Tom Stathes does to spread the word.
I began collecting them so I could watch them myself, but I figured that there must be other people like me out there who wanted to see these things. The wonderful thing about film is to be able to share it with others.
Most of it is never talked about, like we don't watch them on TV. These carnivals are just a great way to get them more exposed and for people to start talking about them again.
Not unlike some of the exhibitors back in the 20s and 30s who would travel from town to town with their magic lanterns and show these wonderful films to the locals who didn't have a movie theater around. Tommy goes to various venues where people can come and congregate and see in 16 millimeter some of the great old cartoons that he has in his collection.
I think I've been somewhere between 12 and 20 times or something. Each screening of the Cartoon Carnival has been filled with new surprises. It's a real treasure trove, I think, of not just animation history, but film history and really, in a sense, visual arts history.
It's my first time experiencing film with live music, and it's like nothing I've ever seen before.
So what you're hearing from me tonight would probably be more the equivalent of if you were in the 1920s and you went to see, in a smaller town, a local pianist accompanying. When I'm accompanying a film, I try to play themes that connect with the emotional context of what the character is experiencing. Everything I play, even though the tunes have all been pre-selected, are completely improvised. And maybe for a more melancholy theme, Only the Lonely Heart, which is a classic you'll hear in many silent film scores and cartoon scores.
the thing is, you can see these cartoons on Blu-ray, TV, but to see them live with an audience is something completely different.
People cheer for when the cartoon comes on that they know and they like. People make, disapproving noises when something racist happens. It's great to be here when people are feeling excited enough and comfortable enough to be vocal, and hear people call stuff out during silent cartoons. That's I feel like that's something that's probably been going on for a really long time.
Winsor McCay was a brilliant artist.
Generally, his films were shown on the stage with him present, only later that they were released into general release without McCay as part of the interactive experience. There's a whole history of cartoonists performing on stage for vaudeville audiences and variety audiences, drawing professionally on stage as an act.
They would do what were called lightning sketch acts. This meant that they would draw very, very fast and, ta-da, end up with a portrait or a caricature of someone in the audience. McCay's act was similar, but when he got interested in animation, he started to put his animated films in the act and to talk about them. The interesting about McCay's work is that he was able to transfer his comic strips to the screen with very little change in the detail and style of those drawings.
His Little Nemo was animated as a one-shot animated cartoon that McCay himself produced over many months of very arduous toil.
A lot of his work depended on dreams. The comic strips were very often worked around a dream situation, so he could work in fantasy. He brought in the things that more related to mythology and legends and the possibilities of flying.
Also simple designs. McCay was able to take this Art Nouveau line and the naturalistic looking characters and give them the kind of movement that we didn't really see until Disney's films hit their stride about 20 years later. McCay always liked to brag that he was the first man to make animated cartoons, but it wasn't true. However, he could rightfully say that he was the father of personality animation.
Gertie is an actress, and a very good actress, and you can see that she forms the template for all these other characters later on.
Personality animation is an indigenously American invention by Winsor McCay, and you can see him evolving in that direction in the first 3 films that he made. In the first one, Little Nemo, he's like Blackton and Cohl. He's very interested in discovering this new world of animation and what it could do and what he could do to make his characters appear magically or have them disappear magically or make them dimensional. But it wasn't personality animation. Characters don't really define themselves by the way they move. However, in the second film that he did, How a Mosquito Operates, he's a strange little character. You can say that he's a very diligent worker. He's very serious about this work as a mosquito. He's always checking with you. There's a chaplainess quality to him. He's always seeing, how am I doing? But now, in the third film, here is the real beginning of personality animation. Gertie is a dimensional character, not just in the animation, which is superb. She has weight. She's a real dinosaur. And she's also a special dinosaur. She's a little girl. She's petulant. She dawdles. She will or will not obey McCay. This was a stage performance McCay did with the character. He was on stage in his vaudeville act with a bullwhip, and he would speak to the screen, which was behind him, and he would command Gertie like a trained elephant. All right, Gertie, lift your paw. Come on, show us. Lift your right foot. And she would dawdle and maybe do it, and finally she did it. And he snapped at her with the whip one too many times, and she snapped at him. And of course, on stage, it was magical because he tries to get away from her.
Well, you have to realize that a great many people in those audiences were unbelievably naive, would believe what they saw was reality. They wanted desperately to believe it. Very quickly, the technique became so sophisticated it went over everybody's head. If you can imagine now, CGI can do anything, and so you just give up trying to work out how it's done. It's just too brilliant.
An early example of the cartoon as propaganda came when the Lusitania, a famous ship of the era, was sunk by a German torpedo, the incident that eventually brought the United States into World War I. Before we'd entered the war, though, Winsor McCay was already at work producing a very lifelike animated cartoon about and how it was downed.
It's almost like a documentary. There were no photographs taken of this disaster, and McCay put the film together through eyewitness accounts from a reporter who heard it from people who survived.
The trouble with animation is it took so long, and it was, I think, 2 or 3 years after the event, but it still served as incredibly powerful propaganda. And its effect is so strong that even now when you see the mother and child under the water, it's very moving.
There are people in the water after the explosions on the ship. There are tiny people falling off of the ship.
What it must have had during the First World War, he was a genius, that fellow.
There's a sentient quality to the ship itself. You feel the wounds of the ship. There's this sensuous Art Nouveau smoke that comes out of the stack. It's a film that is like a moving political illustration.
Even ended with an intertitle that sardonically said, "And they tell us not to hate the Hun."
J.R. Bray's importance is monumental. Has it been overlooked, in some cases even forgotten? That's a crime, but it's unfortunately true.
Well, there's not much known about him personally, but we do know that at some point he got into journalism, then eventually comic art. Early on, he'd come up with his own characters, such as the teddy bears. You can see here that the style is very much in the Victorian cartoon style. Bray had some success, clearly because he was approached by a publisher to create these children's books.
I'd say inspired by McCay, Winsor McCay and Stuart Blackton. the new technology that was going on, he was inspired to try animated cartoons.
In watching Bray's first film, The Artist's Dream, we can draw some conclusions that it was based on how a mosquito operates. It's very much designed as a vaudeville/trick film, but purely in cinematic form.
Well, Charles Pathé was the biggest producer and distributor in the whole world. My wife and I took it over to show it to him, and he was to leave for Paris the next day, but he saw it, and he got so excited about it that he wanted to get a lot of them right away quick, and he signed a contract with me right away.
He wanted one every couple of months or so, maybe even more frequently, but Bray found that he couldn't produce cartoons that quickly. So Bray was the first person, at least successfully, to assemble a group of people, an early team of artists and really filmmakers who were learning this craft as they went along, and start a studio.
I had to train artists. I didn't have anybody but myself at first, you know, and I went up into my apartment up in 112th Street in Riverside Drive. We got half a dozen artists trained, and I started in.
Your first studio was your own apartment then?
Yeah.
I think the significance of the studio was generally as a template for how a lot of studios were organized later on. The sort of tailorization of the workplace, the assembly line approach to making animated cartoons.
There's a division of labor, unlike Winsor McCay or J. Stuart Blackton, where they did the films themselves completely, maybe with one assistant or so. Bray was set up to mass produce animation.
McCay's process was very labor-intensive. The drawings were quite detailed, and his assistant had to draw over and over again on each of these drawings the background.
Well, registration is important because the animator has to make sure that when he draws it, the character isn't moving where it shouldn't be. When it's photographed, it has to always be in exactly the same position. Otherwise, you'll have things flickering around like this. McCay was also using what he learned in the newspaper business. They would have crosshairs on the edge of the artwork, and then they could just position it. So they would take the drawings with crosshairs on them, paste it on these cards, and then fit it in over and over, as many thousands of drawings that they had.
One of the innovations for McCay was what he called the split system. He would make storytelling poses, main poses of his animation, and then fill in the in-between drawings after that. So that was the production pipeline. He would do the main drawings, he would do the in-betweens, and then Fitzsimmons would come along and fit the background in around it.
They had to trace the drawing of the background on every figure. 5 drawings, 5,000 drawings. So that was very tedious, but that was the only way they thought at the time they could do it. The interesting thing is, he took such an intricate, detailed background that just must have made life miserable for the assistant who had to do that.
When you see it on the screen, it's amazing how it doesn't shimmer that much, but it does shimmer, and McCay was happy with that because he said, it's like the breeze going through the trees here and maybe the sun shining off of the rocks, etc., etc.
The thing you have to know is no matter how carefully you trace something, it's not going to be perfect. But McCay was probably thought, since he was a guy who could draw all the time, he just assumed, we can't do it any other way, let's just draw it. Today, that would drive all the producers crazy.
He had the patience and he had the ability to do identical images with a slight difference on an industrial scale, which very few people could do.
Earl Hurd was a very talented cartoonist and animator.
He began making animated cartoons for Universal. Bray had undoubtedly seen these things, and I believe he must have noticed some interesting techniques being used in them.
The idea of putting everything on cells saved the work.
When Hurd came to the Bray studio, they were still producing films in the artist's dream manner, where a background was reproduced as a photoset with a small hole where the animation was to go and the background was to be retraced in that area.
Hurd devised a system of using transparent sheets of celluloid to draw and paint artwork on.
And the background is put over the drawings. It looks like it's behind it, but it's actually over it. And then you have to remove this, change the drawing, and put the background back. So it was always registered. It was always in the right place, and it wouldn't move. And eventually, somebody got the idea, well, we put the background down and then put the character over the background.
That way they could put the moving characters under the camera on top of a static background that could be very elaborately painted and drawn.
It really enabled the animation industry to move forward, and it was a technique that was used for many, many decades afterwards until computers came along.
Really, that's animation. That's what we know when we think of Mickey Mouse and Steamboat Willie or Snow White or The Little Mermaid. That's the technique.
And not only were the Brays bringing Heard's talent into the company, they also formed the Bray-Heard Patent Company.
And the Bray-Heard patent for that technique was used by everybody who wanted to make cartoons, and you'll see their names on animated films into the 1930s. And boy, did he make money off of that.
And as late as 1930, a huge paper trail survives, showing how Bray angrily pursued Felix the Cat's Pat Sullivan and Otto Messmer and other animators for not paying enough to use Bray's cell system and the other processes that he and Heard held under lock and key.
They somewhat broke from the purely creative, artistic side of producing these films, and even though Bray himself continued working on the films directly and animating for them, Bray and his wife really turned into powerful studio heads. Margaret Bray, John's wife, in being so supportive and so encouraging, there was also another side to her, which was that of a very good businesswoman. Historians believe that some of the cunning business decisions that the Brays made might have really come from Margaret.
Bray broke his release into units, and he would release various animators' works sort of serially. He would have 3 or 4 animators working on a project at a given basis, so however often he needed his film, which might have been once a month, he would have film A from animator A, and then the next week he would have B, and A would go back to work, and he could be working on it for a number of months. And you know, there was a certain small staff that would work on whatever the project was at the time, but sort of seemed to have functioned more as sort of an executive producer, probably, than, you know, an active filmmaker.
Another less admirable example of McCay's influence on Bray was Bray's early cartoon Diplodocus, a slightly cruder dinosaur cartoon with a dinosaur that didn't move quite as realistically, and no surprise, it had been produced much more quickly.
It seems that Winsor McCay was somewhat critical of the animators that followed him.
At a dinner given in honor of McCay by all of the animators in New York at that time. So McCay worked his way up to the podium. He decided to to tell them what he really felt. And he said, the way I saw animation was as an art, but when I see what you fellows have done with it, it's a craft. Bad luck.
Here on the silent ear wall, we have Bray Studios cartoons. Those go from about 1913 till 1927.
He's a liar, a blustery little guy who owed something to Teddy Roosevelt, was the first popular ongoing character created explicitly for animated cartoons. There was no He's a Liar comic strip before Bray produced his film, but there were He's a Liar cartoons that would continue on a semi-regular schedule for several years. Suddenly there was this fictional superstar, if you will, who owed nothing to an existing comic strip, but was holding his own just by being part of a cartoon series.
Heard is another comic strip artist whose work begins in the early 20th century as well. He had a comic strip called Brick Bodkins.
While the newspaper syndicate that employed Heard owned the Brick Bodkin character, Heard felt that he could use it independently if he simply called it something else. Therefore, Brick Bodkin mysteriously became Bobby Bumps when it was time to start producing a cartoon series.
Silent animation so much, because Felix the Cat and Bobby Bumps are both like jerks and they're really funny.
The Brays were arranging very lucrative distribution deals, making deals to hire animators, and in many cases being very litigious. They were very well known for going after other animators and really putting them out of business, or in turn bringing them into their own studio.
Film as an industry started in New York, and it had everything to do with Edison being here. It had everything to do with big business being here, money being here. The entertainment field was here. When it comes to animation, it makes perfect sense why animation as an industry would have started here, which again, many people don't realize that. The newspaper syndicates were here. The artists for the comic strips were here. The filmmakers were here. And even some of the people who were immigrants who came from France and other countries in Europe would come to New York and start their careers here.
Bray knew he needed talented animators and writers, people who could actually do the whole thing themselves, to really run in these individual series that he was releasing.
Most of the people that I did meet when I went into the field were 16 years old when they started. They didn't even finish high school, some of them. They were 17, 18 years old. A few of them had gone to college, and they didn't have the skills yet. They were obviously talented young people, but they didn't have the skills. And here they were in a business that was offering a chance to learn a skill that was very viable and was a business.
And he found people who were innovative, who had kind of abandoned print cartooning. People like Paul Terry and Max Fleischer, like Walter Lantz, were jazzed about this new medium of animated cartoons. Yeah, it was more time-consuming and labor-intensive and this and that, but it offered a different kind of satisfaction. And to hear an audience laugh at your cartooning, something that a normal cartoonist wouldn't hear or know, it was made it worthwhile.
So it was sort of, a hub for a lot of stuff that happened later on in animation history.
Of all the little animated cartoon characters that Paul Terry created, his favorite was Mighty Mouse. During the early 1900s, Paul Terry worked in the newspaper field as an artist and photographer. While working as a newspaper cartoonist for the New York Press, Paul Terry met Winsor McCay, and he persuaded Paul Terry to enter the animated cartoon business.
Paul Terry had created first Little Herman and then Down on Phony Farm. The Brays must have seen them at some point, because Margaret Bray approached Terry and explained to him that he'd needed a patent to continue producing animated cartoons. Prior to that, he didn't have one from the Brays. So around 1916, the Brays told Terry that either you join us, you produce cartoons with us, or we will take you to court. So what happened was Terry joined the Bray studio, but somewhat under duress.
His independent Down on the Phony Farm introduced a whiskery old geezer of a farmer who for Bray became Farmer Alfalfa.
So at the Bray studios, Terry's Farmer Alfalfa character really began to grow as a series.
Farmer Alfalfa reflected the agrarian aspect of the country at that time. The United States at that time was greatly a farm country. We had businesses on the East Coast, and everywhere else you had farms and ranches. Hollywood was built on an orange grove. So everything was more about the land and small farms. And that was where a lot of the animators came out of.
was infamous for his use of mice and rats in cartoon after cartoon. He even went on record as saying that if one mouse was funny, 10 mice would be 10 times as funny.
These were the guys Walt Disney looked up to back in the day. Walt said, I hope to one day produce films as good as Aesop's Fables by Paul Terry.
Here we have an interesting item called Mickey Mouse. It doesn't look exactly like the Mickey Mouse that we're familiar with. It's a bit of a mystery in the toy and animation world because it has a patent date of 1926. People have always been confused about this toy, but what we found recently through looking at copyright synopses was that in the Aesop's Fables series, Paul Terry would give his mouse characters certain names. We don't usually see them on screen. I've seen examples of cartoons where the mouse was called Mickey, and in another one, a female mouse was called Minnie. So it could have been possible that Disney was watching the Fables. Perhaps at the time there were intertitles in the films spelling out these characters' names, and perhaps he was inspired to borrow those names eventually.
For a meeting with Paramount's Adolf Zucker, Bray encountered Max Fleischer, a print cartoonist and amateur animator who was trying to interest distributors in a process that he called the rotoscope.
Rotoscoping was something I think that everybody who thought about animation in the early days must have come across. And their idea in their mind says, why don't we just photograph real people and trace them? But Fleischer thought of that, and he patented it.
Fleischer's invention involved projecting live action onto a plate where it could be traced into animated form. This enabled what appeared to be a drawing to move very fluidly and realistically, mimicking the realistic action from which it was traced. Many studios didn't see the potential of Fleischer's invention, but Bray did. Within a very short time, Bray had Fleischer producing educational cartoons for him, where realistically drawn objects would move about, showing how they were to be manipulated by draftsmen or workers. And then a little later, Fleischer began to produce what he really wanted to do with the rotoscope, which was a funny, humorous, character-driven cartoon. Dressing his brother Dave up as a clown, Max filmed him, then used the resulting footage to animate a very realistic clown, who at the time was known only as the Goldwyn Bray clown, named after the studio. Later, that clown would become known as Koko.
I remember being at a film library sale and wondering what these peculiar films were out of the inkwell. And it literally was that. When I projected them, you have a hand, live action, with a pen, dipping it into an ink pot.
Animation itself was considered a trick, and the audience saw it as a novelty trick. And so part of the magic was that you would see the hand of the artist come in with a pen, and they would draw something, and it would come alive. And it looked different. It looked very good because it was smoother action than the stiff action of, say, Colonel He's a Liar.
And then to combine it with live action was thrilling.
He came up with the idea of using photographs, still photos, to put the character cells over it and show that the character is walking in a real scene.
You see a lot of really interesting, complex techniques blending animation and live action. I mean, Fleischer is generally known as a frustrated inventor, but he was an inventor. And if you watch these films sequentially, you see a lot of different things tried out.
The thing that still kind of freaks me out today is some of the cartoons like Lance and Fleischer, where they did live action animation. And we even know how they did that. They shot something in live action first, and then they took every frame and made a giant photograph of it, and then animated the characters onto cells, and then photographed the characters on each frame of that photograph. When it was put together, it looks like the animated character is in the live action picture. It's actually brilliant. because I actually think it looks better than a lot of optical printing that was done in years later. And once in a while when I'm looking at it, I go, oh my God, what did they do there? I can't believe sometimes that they would do some of the gags that they do. Watching that Walter Lantz film yesterday where his face is suddenly animated, it's like, wow, that's cool. I wouldn't even thought to do that.
Animators are really practitioners in the sense that they're problem solvers. When you're assigned a scene and something has to happen, you have to really invent how you're going to do it.
They weren't following rules, they were making rules. And all these people who are not only running a business, but also experimenting and making it grow. You were figuring it out as you were going along, and that's what really, I think, screams at me when I'm watching this stuff.
The way films were made at that time, they were written with what were called scenario cards. This was before storyboards. Literally, you would get a card with a paragraph. It would say, Mutt and Jeff go into an ice cream parlor. Violence or hilarity ensues. And they would distribute them to the animators. And, you know, no model sheets, no nothing. It would be like, hey, look over at some guy over there. How's he drawn it? Maybe I'll draw like that. Maybe I'll draw my own way. You know, so those animators, that kind of animation I tend to find to be the most pure because each animator had their own voice in terms of story contribution, character contribution.
And of course, no video assist at all, no screen anywhere to look at. The only saved image was saved on the film inside the camera, and you couldn't look at it until you sent it away to the laboratories and it came back. Then you viewed it. All that makes life difficult. It means that as an animator, you have to hold all the information in your head.
There's a lot of winging it going on. It was a very improvisational job. A lot of these guys were young. A lot of these guys were drinking. This was during Prohibition especially. And that reflected in films that I think were often really genuinely inventive.
They're also realizing, well, you know, we keep doing the same, repeating the same thing over and over, that cycle of animation. Why don't we break that cycle and do something else and mix it up?
I've always felt that animators sit there, they flip these drawings on their desk, in traditional animation anyway, and saying, I'm a genius, I'm a genius.
Bray said, well, Walter, how'd you like to do the cartoons? And I said, well, who's going to act in it? I'm not an actor. You're going to act. Who's going to write the stories? You're going to write the stories. And gosh, I was given this big job to do, but being a kid, it didn't bother me. I took it on. I wasn't much of an actor. I couldn't act my way out of a paper bag, you know, so I became an actor and didn't have any directors. I had to direct myself. And then after I shot the live action, I had to do the drawings and sweep the floors and everything else, you know.
There's a thread that runs through animation of animated characters alongside their creator.
The urge for the animators to put themselves into their own work, I think in part it was probably economic, that shooting live action is certainly going to cut down on the amount of drawings that they would have to do. It's probably self-promotion to a large extent.
And also it showed that you were the animator. Even though you had 50 guys in back of you drawing this stuff, you were the one in command. And a lot of that went to the producer, whose name was on it. You know, Fleischer, Disney, Bray, that they were the ones that were doing this. So a lot of people thought they did the whole film themselves for many years. And that kind of idea that they weren't was kind of kept a secret. I always ask, who knows who puts all the string beans into the Campbell soup? There's no credits on a can.
And it seems to be a storyline that audiences responded to because they kept it up for years.
And it's interesting that they did that so much, where there was so much interaction with the animator and the cartoon character. And so many people now think that that came from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. They did it all the way back to silent animation. So people could not be more wrong.
It just seems like a very, very compelling myth, almost. It goes back to creation myths. It's about giving life, you know, bringing life to the world. Normally a godlike attitude. It's like that. But there's also a lovely intimacy to it as well. And it shines a light on what you're doing. You're comically deconstructing what you're doing. We've used the same idea, exactly the same idea, but in a different medium. With Morph, you'd see a live-action presenter, you saw his hands, and then you'd see a ball of clay, and that clay would come to life.
It was a real free-for-all in the early New York industry. Anyone who could get the bankroll could start a cartoon studio, and they Often did. There were several shops springing up immediately, usually after somebody got cheesed with J.R. Bray. Max Fleischer violated his contract with J.R. Bray. He jumped ship after about a year and a half. The appeal of that era for me is that not everything was airtight, where it is today, where lawsuit, 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 you know, he wants to go, go.
Paul Terry was another cartoonist animator that worked under Bray and then went on to found his own studio, somewhat in the Bray mold, with, you know, a lot of less than savory business practices, perhaps.
When I met him, I was 18, and a teacher of mine set up a meeting with him. And we sat down in there, and I showed him my portfolio. And he was very fatherly and very, very nice about everything, because he liked to hire people that he felt he was going to be helping out in some way. And I guess I got there at the right moment. He needed someone to be the young junior guide there. I told him that I had been one of the editors of the school newspaper, trying to impress him with something. And he said, well, one day you'll change your ideals. Just like that. And for 35 years, I used to think once a year, what did he mean by that? And then I realized what it was. You compromise. And that's what he did. He started out as a photographer and an artist. He was an illustrator. And he went into business. And animation is an art form, but it's a business. And he learned how to work in it. He was about 40 years old before he really started making any money. And that, I think, dictated a lot of his business ethic. Many of the people that worked for him thought him as a very tight-fisted, stingy guy. But he was running his own shop, and he was paying for everything. He wanted to make sure he was going to make a profit.
Walter Lance's late 1920s cartoons for Bray were the last entertainment cartoons released by Bray.
They had started to make a transition out of character animation into industrials and military-based stuff.
Well, I didn't lose interest in it, but I gave it up pretty well. We still made certain cartoons, but we were in educational films more from then on.
I think the reason an animation studio would want to explore doing industrials or films other than conventional cartoons, let's say, would be that corporations, companies, certainly the military, has a need for how to explain and present data. Animation affords you all sorts of different possibilities for that, and trying to make it as entertaining as possible.
The Secretary of the Army takes pride in presenting the Certificate of Appreciation to John Randolph Bray. I feel highly honored to receive this citation, and in doing so, I receive it on behalf of our company, the Bray Studios, and those associates and members of our staff whose expert planning and efficient services contributed so much to the success of the training film program in the First World War. The first use of training films by any army anywhere. Thank you, sir.
In the silent era, there were not just hand-drawn animated cartoons, there were also stop-motion films featuring puppets, clay, and other techniques that were used. Here we have Kinect Studios cartoons. Those were stop-motion films produced in the late 20s, and we believe that they were made expressly for home use. So they were probably not theatrically distributed. They were made for people to rent from Kodak. Characters in that series were Snap the Gingerbread Man and Chip the Wooden Man. So we have a nice collection of those here.
One reason it works is because the audience cares about something which is obviously handmade. That notion of being handmade, that intimacy, that sense of the closeness of the human touch, it means something to us as filmmakers.
You can find stop motion being used in the very earliest films. It seems like, just sort of endemic to somebody discovering how a camera can be started and stopped.
So stop motion was around from the beginning of movies, and it's always been a novelty because it's a way to see an inanimate object move
or to see a doll come to life, or to see what we would call three-dimensional cartoons.
So this is Morph, character we designed. This is an animation puppet. It's just made out of modeling clay, so it's a very cheap animation puppet, to be honest. If I was on the set, he'd be fixed down as solidly as possible, because what you don't want in puppet animation is anything moving that shouldn't be moving. So I've got my camera set up, so I move him a little bit, and then I take a frame. Now, a frame is, in older thinking, 1/24th of a second. That's the speed at which it will ultimately be projected. Often at Aardman, we simplify that because we think life is too short, and actually because I like being aware of the slight sort of roughness of puppet animation. So I might only move him 12 times a second. That's what we call double frame in the animation business. I come back. I move him again, I take a frame, 2 frames. In between, of course, I think pretty obviously, I get out of the way. So we've talked about stop motion. In a way, this is what it means. I mean, there is no motion. He is actually stopped at any time, but the illusion, when it's projected, is of motion. And that's the very simple way it's done. And it's a really compelling and wonderful illusion that still works today.
The world of stop motion animation kind of went in 2 directions. It was either used in a comical way, or it was used as special effects of some sort.
One very famous film of the 1930s is, of course, King Kong, which featured a stop-motion puppet of the King Kong character. But people don't generally know that years prior to that, animator Willis O'Brien was creating similar stop-motion films for Edison in the 1910s that had a Stone Age theme to them. O'Brien's films are also very intricate, very well designed. Rather than being cartoony, O'Brien's style was very realist. So for him, that lent itself to integrating his stop-motion animation techniques with live action, contributing the animated sequences to The Lost World in 1925.
Willis O'Brien, he was clearly fascinated with dinosaurs, but he was a bit of a dinosaur bone hunter at some stage. He did dinosaurs and monsters. Lost World is an amazing world of dinosaurs. King Kong is absolutely the most famous one. And then Ray Harryhausen came along, and he also took stop-motion animation and populated it with these extraordinary creatures and monsters. He describes going into the Chinese theatre in Hollywood and seeing King Kong and being absolutely blown away. His life was changed full-time by what he saw there. And what he saw was an utterly convincing illusion. Takes us back to The Lost World, because the story is that when people saw The Lost World at the time, they thought they were seeing dinosaurs. They didn't question they were seeing dinosaurs, because what else could it be that they were seeing?
Conan Doyle organised a screening of film that he said he'd taken on a very distant plateau in South America. And he invited all the magicians of America to this theatre, and he screened what he said he saw on that plateau, which were prehistoric animals. And afterwards, he interrogated the audience coming out, and an incredibly high proportion were absolutely convinced.
And I love that story, and I don't even care whether it's true or not, because there's a truth in it. Back in the day, people were not, so well read, of course, in film and special effects, especially in the time of Lost World, so they believed their eyes, and yes, there's clearly a living dinosaur, and I love that.
When Tom does his shows, he usually gets a great crowd, and everybody embraces each film, every character that he shows.
Here in the film closet, then we have some silent Disney, such as the Alice comedies, Oswald the Rabbit.
I think probably my favorite so far is Koko the Clown.
Further up, we have more Bray material
I really like Bobby Bumps, Dinky Doodle.
and several films that were based on comic strip characters such as Happy Hooligan and Jerry on the Job.
I basically, as a kid, was a big fan of the comic strip Crazy Cat. Also, I was a big fan of the theatrical shorts.
Mutt and Jeff, very popular series in the 20s.
I do like those Paul Terry cartoons now. Those were fun. And I like the Felix the Cat cartoons.
Pat Sullivan's studio cartoons. We have about 100 cans in that collection. Before this, the majority of them were in my bedroom with me, so they've moved on up a bit.
But before the closet, there were film cans everywhere and reels everywhere. Not only did he have them here, but he had managed to coerce his other relatives to keep things in their attics, in their garages, in their basements.
And that was about maybe 7 or 8 years ago that I started putting them in here. So in that time, I would say the number of cans have doubled in the collection. And as you can see, we're near capacity right now. Well, the floor is not full yet, so we might just start filling up from the back here.
He was a very interesting child. Tommy was about 3 days old, and his father was a policeman, and he had to get up at all hours to go to work. And my son would, you know, he was crying or not sleeping or, you know, so I had to find a way to entertain him. And I grabbed a VHS tape of Fantasia and Silence. It was magic. He was enthralled. He wasn't crying, he wasn't, nothing. That was it. And I knew that was the magic to keep him, you know, entertained and silent and focused on something at 3 days old.
Either as gifts for birthdays or for Christmas or just a casual stroll going into the supermarket or the drugstore, there would be all of these wonderful looking cartoon VHS tapes that you could buy. So for very little money, any little kid could start their own little collection of cartoons.
Felix is fantastic and one of the greatest cartoon characters ever, and his films are just great. They're inventive, imaginative, and endearing.
The origin of Felix is actually a little bit more complicated than a lot of people know. It's widely understood that Pat Sullivan, the head of the Felix studio, for many years claimed to be the creator of Felix. In the early days, he often said that his wife was a cat person and brought home a mangy stray, and suddenly like lightning it struck me, I must create a cat. But it wasn't really as simple as all of that, and Otto Messmer, Sullivan's longtime second, was widely understood within the studio as being the true creator of Felix.
Well, the Sullivan studio was very busy, and Paramount, they were falling behind their schedule, and they needed one extra to fill in. And Sullivan, being very busy, he said, if you want to do it on the side, you can do any little thing to satisfy them. So I figured a cat would be about the simplest. Make them all black, you know, you wouldn't need to worry about outlines.
The first Felix cartoon proper was called Feline Follies in 1919, and Messmer began it as a one-shot, but it was successful enough that even before its release, more cartoons with this cat character, originally called Master Tom, were produced, and with the third cartoon, he got his well-known name of Felix.
We used to call it Feline Follies up to that point, and he figured it ought to have a name, so he suggested if we would care to give it the name of Felix, which we kicked around a little bit and decided this was it, meaning feline and felicity. Good luck, cat.
Felix was new. He was different. He acted differently. He had personality.
He was the first character in a series to really carry on that personality animation that was begun by Winsor McCay. Whereas most characters ran. Felix would run, but then he would stop and think about the problem that he was encountering and then find a solution.
I mean, there's a lot of Felix sort of explaining visually what he's about to do before he does it in those films that you don't see otherwise. He'll literally pantomime out, and he'll point, he'll roll his eyes, he'll gesture. And movies were made basically for the middle-class audience and lower-class audience. Audiences were largely made up of immigrants early on. It was a very economic form of entertainment. The ideas needed to be communicated in a non-verbal or non-written way.
You don't even need the intertitles. You don't need to speak English even to understand what's going on in that cartoon.
Unlike a lot of later cartoon characters who became known for being cheerful and squeaky clean, Felix was very often in a bad mood.
The three basic needs of the Felix character were food, sex, and shelter, and not necessarily in that order.
And it's surreal in the sense that sometimes he uses his tail, just takes it off, it turns into a sword or something, and that gives you the impression that you're going to be surprised whenever you see Felix.
Felix had the magical properties that animation can properly exploit. He could metamorphose himself into anything he wanted to.
Felix super significant. It was that he was the first original animated creation that became a star. There were other original cartoon characters, Colonel He's a Liar and Bobby Bumps and the like. There were certainly other star characters, ones from the comic strips, but Felix was made for animated cartoons and became a sensation.
A big part of that was what Pat Sullivan was actually doing while Otto Mesmer was making the films. Sullivan was making the deals. There were Koko the Clown dolls, maybe a few others, but for every other example you can think of, there would be dozens of Felix products. It was just huge.
Felix was so popular as a cartoon character that people wanted to buy the sheet music from the cartoons. There were theme songs written for the character. This is in the silent era.
The excitement surrounding Felix also brought him into comic strips, which meant that for one of the first times, a cartoon character originated for cartoons made the step into comics.
All sorts of things which brought in ancillary income for the studio.
Which is really the basis of the entire animation business from that point up to till today. And of course, during the silent era, the late 20s, very famously, a Felix doll was used to see if they were actually broadcasting from one room to another. They needed something to shoot, and it was a Felix the Cat doll, which makes, in some ways, Felix the first cartoon character to appear on television.
I think as a whole, the films are much more carefully constructed than a lot of the other series that were being done at the time.
Felix' design changed.
Well, the first ones, he was more angular, more like a dog, you know what I mean? But we found out, there's a little difficulty when you start moving these angles.
When Mesmer was the studio manager, he hired different animators. One of them was a man named Bill Nolan, who was a very fast animator, but the Felix stuff slowed him up. So he just eliminated the snout on Felix, and he made the character a rounded character. His animation came to be called rubber hose and circle animation. So you have appendages like arms and legs that are like spaghetti, rubber hoses, and then you have these circular forms which form the body and the head of Felix. This was a form that was adapted by most of the animators from the mid-1920s on. You just change ear shapes and you have a different kind of character. And of course, Walt Disney adapted this with Mickey Mouse. And Mickey becomes the perfect character because circles are a perfect form. They imply softness, they imply sensuality, they are eternal. The circle is an eternal shape. It's infinity.
In 1920, Walt Disney was a young entrepreneur in Kansas City who, with his friend Ub Iwerks, developed advertising art for a local agency. They got the idea of producing some cartoons themselves and selling them to a theater where the cartoons could function as animated editorial cartoons. They were called Newman Laughograms for the Newman Theater. They contained some unashamed editorializing about problems in Kansas City at the time. One little subsection entitled The Kansas City Spring Cleanup, for example, showed the cops not going after crooks or others, but simply the chief firing a lot of cops, presumably for corruption. With the success of the Newman Laugh-O-Grams, Walt Disney interested a small-time distributor called Pictorial Clubs to buy a series of Laugh-O-Grams that were instead fairy tale parodies.
One thing about it, he wanted to appear ahead of the other studios that were all in New York at that time. He wasn't the first one to do it, but he wanted to show that he was doing it the most modern way at that time.
Walt and Ub Iwerks partnered with a local family whose little girl wanted to get into the movies and who appeared in a film that the Disneys called Alice's Wonderland.
The Alice comedies were Disney's version of what Fleischer was doing with Koko. Koko was an animated character who appeared in the live scenes. Disney reversed it. He got a live little girl and put her in an animated background with animated characters.
Walt wanted to make a series of Alice's Wonderland and soon met with Margaret Winkler, a distributor of that time. And Winkler decided that Walt Disney's project was something she wanted to get interested in. Walt Disney moved out to California to have his meetings with Winkler, and not too long afterwards, Ub Iwerks and other staffers from the Laugh-O-Gram days in Kansas City had come to join him as the Disney studio grew and expanded.
The problem with that series was that doing that became a little difficult and tedious, and they really wanted to do just animation. So you see less and less of her as the series moves on, and it lasted about 7 years.
There was also a conflict with Winkler and Mintz insofar as the lead animal character in the Alice comedies, Julius the Cat, was a transparent Felix imitation. Walt didn't want Julius to be too close to Felix, and the earliest Julius in the Laugh-O-Grams was a little bit closer to Crazy Cat and to other earlier comic strip cats, but Winkler, who had been burned by Pat Sullivan after distributing his films for a short while, felt that she wanted a very Felix-like character. After a while, getting away from Alice was also a way for Walt Disney to have a character that owed less to other characters.
By the time they got to Oswald, they had learned a lot about animating funny little characters, and Oswald's a very funny character.
There was just this lightning in a bottle feeling to many of the Oswald cartoons at that time, and one movie magazine pointed out that they had jumped into the first-run favor overnight. The Oswald cartoons had some of the best animation, the most elaborate animation, and some of the most interesting experimental animation of their time.
And they do a lot of squash and stretch and ridiculous little things just with pen and ink drawings.
There was a fluidity and a bounce to the action that very few other cartoons had at that period, and that owed a lot to two other stalwarts who'd come to join the Disney studio from Kansas City, Hugh Harman and Rudy Ising.
It really brought life into the drawing. So in the space of about 15 years, they'd gone from very stiff characters to looser characters.
Walt and his brother Roy and Ub Iwerks got involved with Universal under a contract that, from a modern perspective, was terribly slanted against them. It gave Universal and even Winkler all the rights to the Oswald character, but Walt had very few rights of his own. Oswald was so popular and the cartoons were so famous for their sophistication that Walt never imagined that it could work against him. But in the spring of 1928, when Walt went to Charles Mintz to negotiate the Universal contract for the second season, Mintz said, well, from now on you're going to make the Oswalds cheaper or I'll simply remove you. And if he didn't like the deal that Mintz was offering him, the only option he really had was to leave. So with Ub Iwerks and a couple of other animators, Walt began to produce what became the Mickey Mouse series, originally for independent distribution, simply so that he could survive without Oswald.
The Paris Exposition of 1900 had sound pictures. In 1913, Edison introduced sound again, and the audiences made it quite clear that they weren't interested. And it didn't wipe silent pictures out immediately, but The Jazz Singer in 1927 is generally recognized as the most influential sound film, although it was a terrible picture. The thing that thrilled people far more than The Jazz Singer was the following year when Disney brought out Steamboat Willie with all those sound effects. You can run it now and you still get the same kick out of it as they got in 1928. When sound arrived, and finally, after many experiments, the pictures had to be made cheaply. Therefore, they were very simple and tended to be very dull. The one thing the animation people weren't restricted by, they could still be as wild and surreal and put sound effects on.
Walt Disney was not the first person to think of making cartoons with sound. Several years before the famous Steamboat Willie, Max Fleischer had produced some sing-along cartoons where there was a bouncing ball on screen and text moving underneath. Several of the Fleischer cartoons in the mid-20s really were released with synchronized sound, but there weren't a lot of theaters that could play them at that time. Nevertheless, Fleischer did have sequences in those films that would never have worked in silent form. So Fleischer was essentially there before Disney, but what Fleischer didn't do was tell a full-length story that didn't need a song. A story that was structured like any other cartoon. Walt wasn't the first to do that either, though. In the summer of 1928, Paul Terry, of all people, notorious corner cutter, nevertheless produced the cartoon Dinner Time. Walt Disney was there for an early showing of this film. It didn't inspire Steamboat Willie, it was too late for that, but it had beaten Walt to the punch. Walt looked at it, and the telegram still survives today that says, "We have nothing to worry about from these quarters." The talking part doesn't even match.
To the general public, animation begins and maybe ends with Walt Disney. Part of that is because Disney himself and the studio he created progressed the field in a big way. He came in with sound, or popularized color, and multiplane. Again, if he didn't invent these things himself, and he didn't, his studio made the best of it.
Another conflict over sound happened before Steamboat Willie 2, and that was where Educational Pictures, the distributor of Felix the Cat, demanded that Pat Sullivan and Otto Messmer bring Felix over to sound. Sullivan and Messmer were essentially given the choice of beginning sound production before anybody else did, figuring out how to do it, or losing their contract. Sullivan didn't think they would lose their contract, so Sullivan refused and lost the contract. And from autumn of 1928 to summer of 1929, there were no new Felix the Cat cartoons because it was too late to have another distributor in line for that fiscal year. That also meant that when Mickey Mouse made his sound debut in Steamboat Willie, there were no new Felix cartoons to compete with.
Well, so long, folks. See you all later.
In order to make people welcome sound, the studios used to take very early primitive biographs, then they put honky-tonk music and so-called funny commentaries on them.
Baby Hicks is booted from the bottle babe to a beautiful babe on a bench. And he doesn't mind a bit.
And people looked at these and thought, were these the films we loved so much? And of course they weren't, but nobody told them that. They just made them, the whole era, seem ridiculous.
After World War II, broadcasting in a big way started. People could have a television in their house and something beamed to it. But in those early days of TV, there was no videotape. TV was generally live. Wrestling and baseball games were the big things on television. There were talk shows, variety shows. They also found they could run old movies. Silent animation was perfect fodder for early television.
What I have here are examples of boxes created for TV distribution packages. Any television station could call up Commonwealth Pictures and order something like 300 Farmer Alfalfa, Aesop Fables cartoons.
For people watching at home, it was actually delightful. It was wonderful to be able to see these classic old cartoons on their TV screens. It was magic.
The station would either show them on their own, but the other thing that was happening pretty often was that there were kiddie TV shows with hosts.
Now, why don't we watch a cartoon about kittens? What's the name of it? What? The cartoon. Oh, the name of the cartoon is called The Cat's Revenge. How old are they? Who? The cats. Now, don't you start with me. Don't you start with me, Duncan.
You know, the perception that animation is for kids, which still exists in America today, this came about because of cartoons being shown on television in the 1950s. The TV programmers generally programmed them at times that were for kids. They were kiddie shows.
Our next cartoon is a real whipper-whopper. You'll get a sock out of it.
The silent animation wasn't necessarily aimed at children or made for kids. It was made for the whole audience.
Now, they've always been understood to have a special appeal to kids who like to see outrageous characters in action. But in the silent era, cartoons were marketed to all ages and often had a special appeal to adults.
Slightly more sensible companies acquired outdated silent films and brought them out for home movie use in vast numbers, particularly cartoons. They were short, they were immensely popular, they were just what was needed for children's parties. So you had all sorts of characters you've never heard of before.
In the 20s, you could go out to the store or through a catalog purchase these short clips of films that were reprinted specifically for toy projectors. This one I have here is, let's see, Felix the Cat cartoon, about 5 seconds of one.
Toy projectors had ordinary household bulbs which used to get hot, and the children used to stop a favorite frame to look at it, and there were many, many accidents. And that's why 9.5, the first thing you saw on every 9.5 film was a triangle for safety film. And safety was to last indefinitely. But now we discover it's got a horrible disease called vinegar syndrome.
A good way to tell when a film is beginning to deteriorate is that it will start to have a vinegar odor. And at the final stages of that process, we have an unusable print. So here we have something that probably 20 or 30 years ago was starting to smell, and then now it's turned into a hockey puck. And there's nothing really that you can do with this anymore. You could slow it down by keeping it out of the can, and that's because it'll off-gas. The gases will also start to eat at the film. But really the best thing is to copy it. I mostly save something like this just to show people what can happen to these films.
But by duplicating these copies onto safety film, that did save a lot of these rare cartoons. Very important to know, in the earliest days of television, the movie studios thought of TV as the enemy. Because if you were going to stay home and watch anything or movies on TV, you were certainly not going to come out and see movies in the theater. And that's what led to, in the theaters, color and 3D and CinemaScope and things like that. The silent cartoon making was a different animal, a different way of telling the stories than the way the contemporary cartoons were of that time. So the movie studios really did not care about that stuff. To them, it was old news.
What could the studios do with all this stuff? Well, some of them loaded barges with nitrate negatives and positives and took them out to the deep water off Los Angeles Harbor and dropped them overboard.
Silent films in general are scarce. More than half of them are gone, lost, thrown away, deteriorated. Animation was sort of the least of it. If people did save something back in the old days, it was generally a feature or a live-action short or something, and animation was just kind of guitar picks. It was junk.
In many cases, the only surviving examples of a film are sometimes housed in one of these smaller gauge formats. Many significant things that I have only survive in that form, because in many cases, no negatives still survive, or not even complete prints. My hunt for the cartoons involves other collectors. Other times I will go to antique shops and flea markets and look for cans of film around. Other times I'm looking on eBay, and sometimes I found them that way. I do have holy grails, but kind of everything is democratically of interest to me.
I was obsessed with trying to find a lost film on eBay, and I found something called Doggone It, which was a Bray cartoon. I really had no idea what Bray Studios was at the time, but there is this really helpful website, and it was run by Tommy Stathes, and I went into contact with him, and turns out the cartoon, he actually had a print just like that in his collection, so. But I did eventually find a lost film, Arthur Lake's Who's Baby from 1929. Ta-da!
Some archives are very helpful, others aren't. But you can also, with collectors too, I've been able to find so much rare stuff in terms of animation, silent comedy, from collectors. That stuff that I thought previously did not exist.
The strangest that I ever heard about was from Liam O'Leary, who was working at the National Film Archive, and he found a Victor Seastrom film in a chicken run. But the majority of pictures that I've found have been in fairly mundane places.
In many cases, a lot of the films I found just turn up out of nowhere. It is very satisfying to find films that I've been looking for many years. In many cases, those films were considered lost or hopelessly unavailable. Finding films this way, I've become an optimist to say that things that are considered lost do have a chance of being found again.
The best of the silent era has never been surpassed, and it is tragic that so much has been lost already, and it would be madness to let any more go. The next generation would condemn us if we didn't preserve it.
I'm here at BAM, the Brooklyn Academy of Music in downtown Brooklyn, to see a collection that was curated by Tommy Stathes. I noticed, too, that it wasn't people coming that had come to some of the other screenings like this. This was a group of people from all sorts of walks.
We need to get film critics, tastemakers, bloggers. We need people to get out there, see this, and to tell people you're missing an incredible, different experience. This is a whole new field, even though it's 90 years old.
Silent films are very much a part of Film Canada, but silent animation kind of gets lost in the way.
You should know a little bit about Felix the Cat and Judge Rummy and Bobby Bumps and Farmer Al, and just kind of get a general sense at the very least. And you know what you might find? You might find that you really like it, because that's what I found.
The silent period of animation was an exciting time of innovation and experimentation. An art form that was finding its way, which is always exciting.
The achievement of the pioneers is absolutely astonishing and wonderful. to me, because I suppose they'd never seen it done or barely seen it done.
We know how they did it in a very primitive way, no optical printers, and you'll still hear the audience go, whoa, how did they do that? It's magic, the magic of movies.
You're watching an industry create itself. It's wild.
It's always bothered me that that period is often called crude. Comparing it to what came afterwards, what happened in the silent period was proper for what happened then, and it was great. Never been any greater expression of Felix the Cat than was done in that particular period. And McCay before him, searching for something that Disney later developed into its fullest fruition, personality animation.
It's inspiring to hear people respond to films that are in some cases 100 or more years of age, and they still have a potency to them. They still have tremendous imagination involved with them. There still is something extremely fresh and extremely energizing and extremely inspiring about these films.
A great period, and you know, everything that came afterwards was an enhancement of what was already there, I think.